What's going on, guys? Happy Monday. Today is June 7th, and I'm going to go ahead and deem this as the kickoff episode to the summer 2021 podcast episodes. As much as I would love to keep talking about turkey hunting, I guess we have to leave that behind eventually. Jordan and I finished up turkey season this past week in Michigan, and everyone's back home now and going to try to endure these hot Mississippi summer months. But I like the summer episodes, during the fall and spring, elk season, deer season, duck season, turkey season, whatever, we tend to focus on those topics. And the summer, we like to get creative and talk about some just some things that we don't get to focus on when hunting season is in. So excited about that. This episode in particularly, I'm talking with Dr. Marcus Lashley. Y'all might remember him just from this past spring. We talked about prescribed burning earlier when turkey season was in. And this week we're talking about, per y'all's request, a lot of y'all, when we reach out and say, hey, what do y'all want us to talk about? Always, y'all bring up the subject of land management in all different facets. If it's from food plots and planning to timber management to trapping to habitat, everything that encompasses land management. So I couldn't think of anyone more informed than Dr. Lashley, and he had a very interesting IGTV video that he put up on the University of Florida Deer Lab's Instagram, that they were kind of talking about the balance between trapping and land management and how that relates to fawn recruitment and so on and so forth. And it actually, just in that short IGTV video, it kind of, broke some of the myths or some of the common things that you hear. And I said, this would probably be something that our listeners would like to hear about. And so I'm not going to go into any more detail. I'm going to let him do that because he knows a lot more than I do. I think y'all really enjoy this conversation. But first, before we get into it, I want to remind you about the onX Hunt app. onX is something that we literally use every single day. Whether it's elk season, deer season, duck season, turkey season, whether we're upland hunting, it does not matter. onX Hunt is a game changer. It helps us tremendously. I promise you, it'll be one of those apps that you get and you will not regret it. So go check out the onX Hunt app today and use the promo code Primos20 to save 20% on your onX Hunt membership. Hope y'all have a good rest of the Monday and a good rest of the week, and enjoy the episode. I hadn't even thought about that from a teacher side of things, dealing with with the whole pandemic and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was still, going around and doing research and visiting with landowners and stuff. So there's no telling where I'm going to be when I'm teaching. So I just kind of use the standard background.
Right. I understand.
For them.
It's appropriate that would have been really appropriate the last time we talked when we were talking about fires and whatnot.
Sure.
Yeah. So what's going on, man? That's what's going on in your part of the world.
Oh, not too much. I'm actually in Alabama now, doing some food plot stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. So my parents live in Sumter County, Alabama. It's right on the Mississippi line. Not too far from Cuba.
Yeah. I heard that. I guess before we jump into the guts of everything, we can have a little bit of entertaining talk. Did you get to break away and do a little bit of turkey hunting yourself, or no?
Yeah, I got to hunt a fair amount this year. I hunted in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 states, so pretty decent. And I think I probably got in the woods 20 or 25 times, something like that. But
I got a few
turkeys. So probably didn't get to enjoy it as much as you did, but that's pretty good for me.
Yeah. Well, I saw you were you hunted with Craig Harper a few times, didn't you?
Yeah. I went up. So he was my mentor, and we still go hunt together quite a bit. And we also have some projects going on together. So we kind of use that as an opportunity during turkey season to visit study sites and kill a couple turkeys while we're at it. So
I like that. Finding ways to work it in. Yeah. I sat in on a seminar of his. It has to have been at least 3 years ago now. But it was at it was like the QDMA convention, I think. They had it in New Orleans, but
may have
in
said
Georgia.
I gave one at that one 3 years ago, I think, as well.
Oh,
So
okay. Yeah. We were only there for like, I don't know, a day or two. I don't remember, but I
yeah,
remember Jordan knew who he was, and I had not heard of him. We sat in on that seminar, and he was like a lot of those guys, like you and Dr. Craig and Chamberlain. It's like every time I'm exposed to them, like talking on things for the first time, and which segue into what we ended up talking again back on. But y'all, one thing I'll come out and say this, like I initially started following y'all's Instagram page. Was it's correct? It's the UF Deer Lab, right? Is that
yeah.
okay?
Yep.
Y'all have been like that page is most of our listeners, all of our listeners are going to be turkey eccentric or deer eccentric and just hunting minded people. And a lot of our listeners like
Yeah.
so the content y'all put out there, man, is excellent for someone trying to just wanting to learn. Y'all really do a good job with that.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
So yeah, I'll probably plug it again at another
I
point.
appreciate it. I mean, it's
Yeah.
yeah. Well, please do. We're trying to grow just so we can get information out, but I think that comes from being a passionate hunter for my entire life.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the ways that I can gather information and give that information to hunters in a way that they want it and it's digestible. So hopefully that shows with what we're putting out there.
Sure thing. So the very topic of this podcast itself is based off of something that y'all put out on an Instagram page. Y'all put it was an IGTV video where they were talking specifically about trapping and how that goes hand in hand with property management. And I think the terminology that I used when I text you saying I wanted to do a podcast about this, because like I said, it's never ending. When we ask folks what they want to hear on this podcast, it's the topic of land management, and then go more specific and what can I do to help my deer herd? What can I do to help my turkeys, and so on and so forth. Those kind of questions are never ending. They're always wanting us to talk about that, and obviously we like to cater to that. And so I watched this IGTV video, and he's talking about trapping and how the thing that caught me is like right at the beginning is he was saying that he tries to steer landowners away from going that route first off. So
Yeah,
let's open up with that, because
that was
yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot of things for us to unpack on this issue, and the first thing, that was Dr. Will Goolsby at Auburn University that I was interviewing on that, and he's one of the researchers. He's also a lifelong hunter and loves hunting and fishing, and I know him well and know that that's what he's passionate about. And he had also been involved in several long-term studies, the best studies that we have with coyote removals related to fawn survival. And, we've kind of been bouncing that idea around. And I think the problem is that some of the stuff isn't necessarily directly intuitive. And so I think we should unpack some of these things. But the reason that he said that, and it's sort of a default, I think, for some biologists, without even actually knowing why they're saying it in some cases, is that we really commonly see landowners trying to fix their problems by removing predators and not addressing other issues that they have. And I think that's what he was getting at when he came out the gate, kind of firing like that. The reason that he said that he steers people away from it, and I agreed with him, is because we see people go all in on predator trapping and kind of neglect the other problems that are underlying with habitat in particular. And sometimes that's because people don't own the land and they can't do anything else, and that's understandable. But a lot of times people do own the land, and they have options that might be much cheaper and much more effective with to accomplish their goals. So I think just to start going through, if we're talking about coyote trapping for fawn survival, we've had several studies now, and I don't know how many there have been in the United States, but there have been 4 or 5 really key ones in the southeastern United States, where we have intensively trapped coyotes right during fawning. We've had professional trappers who are very good at what they do. They remove lots of coyotes. It's intensive. It's on really large scales. And even doing that, we can't consistently produce more fawns. And that, to me, I'm right there with you. Initially, I was like, I don't understand this. How is that possible?
That's a head scratcher. Yeah.
Yeah, like how could that be? Obviously, removing coyotes should result in less coyotes, and less coyotes should result in less fawns being eaten. And after doing this several times, including one study that I think they followed fawn survival on a really large area at Savannah River site. John Killigo was the lead principal investigator on that project. They followed fawn survival in 2 big areas on Savannah River site for 4 years, and then they implemented 4 years of intensive trapping on part of it. But it was still thousands and thousands of acres, way larger than the scale than the average person would have access to. And, removing hundreds of coyotes in these areas. And they did that for 4 years. And they had one, I think it was the initial year, they had a bump in fawn survival in the trapped area. And then they had 2 years where they did not see anything. And then they had 1 year, I don't remember what order they were in, but they had 1 year where the fawn survival was lower in the trapped area. So it's like, wow, that really didn't work.
Yeah, that's so
then they started trying to figure out why.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, we started trying to figure out why, and I was one of these people, and during my PhD work and postdoc work, I was working on an area in North Carolina, Fort Bragg military installation, where the deer population was not doing well, and coyotes had recently colonized. And when I say recent, I mean in the last few decades. And they were concerned about coyote predation. We were following adults and fawns in that population, and the coyotes. We had radio tags. So one of the things that may have been striking to you when you watch that video that we put on, we put one of the coyotes' movement patterns that we had collared in that study in that video, and it became apparent one thing that's a real problem is the scale at which we're operating and the scale at which the coyote populations are operating. And we radio tagged that individual, and I think it was an adult female even. It wasn't even one that was supposed to be moving, right? And we put a collar on her, and it was only a few months later, she was several hundred miles away in a different state. And we had multiple coyotes do that. And there have been coyotes collared in eastern North Carolina that did that. There have been some collared in Georgia and I think in Alabama as well, where they've literally moved hundreds of miles in a very short period of time. And they're not in the back of a truck, right? They're walking. The one that we put on, the specific one we put in that video, we tracked basically from point to point a minimum distance it would have had to walk over a 3-month period or whatever it was. And it was 900 miles, I think. It was the minimum distance, that it would have had to walk. So I think that's one thing that is not it's not initially intuitive, but when you think about the scale at which they're operating, then it starts to make a little bit of sense.
Yeah.
Okay. You can intensively trap, but next week you might have a coyote replace the one you removed from a county over. Right? We just can't operate at that scale.
Yeah.
Unless everybody gets together and we start operating at a county level scale, we're going to have this issue of immigration. And a lot of the coyotes, Will Goolsby talked about that in the video. He's done some studies looking at how many of the coyotes are transient like that. And it's a large portion of them is the short end of it. A lot of coyotes are just kind of bouncing around waiting to jump in. So another issue, and we really need to study this stuff more because we don't understand it very well. I'll caveat with that, but we are having these studies come out, and every one is just like an eye-opening thing for me.
Right.
Another study by another colleague in Virginia, she's really good with movement ecology and understanding how to model that with things like coyotes that are really hard to follow because they're bouncing around at such a large scale. It's really hard to model, but she basically did this model to really look at what the coyote is doing while it's moving around, and essentially what the pattern came out, it looked like a donut. Their home range in terms of their use, it looked, they kind of had this cold spot in the middle where they didn't use it so much, and then it was really intensively used all around the border. And what I think she kind of alluded to, and what we think was happening, just as science as a whole, is that the coyote is defending its boundaries really well. So it's using a lot of its time to defend its territory.
Yeah.
And that kind of suggests, and there are some studies, especially out west, that suggest this, that if you remove a dominant female in particular, essentially her, she's spending a lot of her time defending her borders, and what happens is if you remove her, then she stops defending those borders, and then all the transients apparently can move in. You may actually temporarily, and that, again, we don't have very good data on this, and it's scattered all over the place, but we think that, she's spending all of her time defending that territory. And when she stops doing that, the transients apparently fill in really quickly. And in some cases, they might have to reestablish who's going to be dominant. So you may end up temporarily with a whole lot more coyotes than you usually would have had.
Wow. That's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. And so let's back up for a minute. Does trapping ever work? Yes, it does in some systems. So particularly intensively trapping mesocarnivores that are nest predators. That's been shown with quail and turkeys and grouse, I think. So in those systems, intensively trapping can increase nest success.
Mm-hmm.
And just think about the scale issue that we were just talking about.
Right.
You're operating at a much different scale with those predators, and intensively trapping, you can kind of temporarily at least cause this low population during that critical time. So in that scenario, there have been some cases where we've increased nesting success.
Right.
But even that's pretty inconsistent. And that's also telling to me, and let me just give you two examples of where it was inconsistent. One, Bill Palmer, who's now the director at Tall Timbers, his research in North Carolina during his graduate studies was pretty interesting to me. He was studying quail nesting success, and he did it in a factorial design, which basically means he had a population of quail he was following, he didn't do anything to, and then there was a quail population, and this was replicated on multiple properties. There was a quail population where they only trapped nest predators. And then they had one where they actually, it was an agricultural landscape. They started increasing the amount of usable field borders, which are just high quality early succession for nesting for quail.
Right.
And then they had properties where they did both. In that study, when they removed predators but did not improve habitat conditions, there was no effect of removal. They didn't, removing all the nest predators did not result in more nest success.
Mm-hmm.
When they improved habitat, that increased nest success. And then when the two were done together, that was an even bigger bump in nest success. So in other words, the effect of predator trapping on those quail populations was habitat dependent.
Yeah. So the interesting thing there for me, it's been, let's see, probably 3 or 4 years ago, I had Adam Butler come on. He's the head of the turkey program in Mississippi,
Yeah.
and he said something that was completely consistent with what you just said. Talking
Yeah.
about nest predators, he said he always directs people. He says, I'm not going to tell someone not to trap, but he said, he's like, I'm not going to, push anyone away from doing that in terms of nest predators. But he said, if you don't put emphasis on improving the habitat, then you're not, exactly what you just said. He goes, you're not going to see any real significance,
Yeah.
it's, as far as nest success. It's the habitat had to be the absolute key, which makes sense.
Yeah. Well, what people, I know people get tired of hearing about that. I know that because I tell people that, and they tell me they're tired of hearing it all the time. But I mean, it really does make sense when you're addressing habitat. You're addressing all the things that the animal needs, right? And you're not just addressing one specific thing at a time.
Yeah.
And it makes a lot of sense. And that's one of the better studies. There are a few more like that where we actually have all of them going on at once. But the problem that we have with white-tailed deer or wild turkey, or something that has a predator that's so wide-ranging like coyotes, we don't have any studies that are a factorial like that. That was kind of a unique example where we can operate at a scale on quail with those nest predators where they could demonstrate that. And I think we still need to work on that, but they pretty well showed that relationship with quail, that habitat was important first. Trapping on top of habitat can provide some additional benefit if you're doing it intensively at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
So let's given that we don't have those good experiments with deer and turkey, let's talk about some other things that some other data that we do have, and we can think through reasons why we might not see the same thing with these other species, given that coyotes are their predator. So Will Goolsby in that video talked about a study he was involved with, and I think this is probably the best study out there, but we still need more work on it. He went back to the study site in Savannah River where they had that long-term data set. They initially looked at the habitat conditions around an individual fawn to see if the plant communities locally were influencing their survival. And they initially said no. So in other words, right at a fawn site, if you go and measure all the characteristics associated right at that fawn site, it doesn't matter. And we did the same thing in North Carolina, and it's been done 3 or 4 more times in different places, and we always come out with that answer. The local habitat structure doesn't influence the survival probability of that individual. Okay. What Will did was go back and it's like, okay, well, let's look at the landscape context that the fawn is in, and does that matter? And he looked at it from a lot of different kinds of, or a lot of points of view, I guess. And what he settled in on, what showed that it actually did matter, was the amount of different kinds of cover that the fawn had access to mattered a lot. So while it didn't necessarily matter if it was laying in this old field here, or this thin pine stand over here that has what we would think of as excellent cover, or this hardwood stand, this closed canopy that has poor cover, it didn't really matter that much which one of those it was laying in. What mattered was that it had a whole bunch of those options. And I don't necessarily think that's because the fawn or the mother is having a choice to put it where the lowest risk is. I think what it's showing us is that the coyote has several more things to consider when it's trying to figure out where to hunt.
Yeah.
But we're increasing the complexity of decision making for the coyote, and coyotes are lazy just like we are, right?
Yeah.
They're going to find the things that are easiest to catch, and when they have a whole bunch of different habitat types like that, probably what we're seeing them do is they're generalists, and they're eating what's easy to find. And fawns, by intent are hard to find, especially when you give them the opportunity to be hard to find. And it's really easy to catch berries when they're hanging around on plants everywhere. And it's, easy to catch small mammals relatively when there's a whole bunch of them around. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what we think is happening, is it increasing the landscape complexity, just making the decision-making process a little more difficult. And also, it also makes a whole bunch of different kinds of resources available that are easy pickings.
Right. You're taking it to where that coyote can't go, okay, there's literally one place that these fawns can be.
Right. So and we demonstrated that pretty well, I think, at Fort Bragg, where that's a landscape that's under really frequent fire, and it's sandhill.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, when you have really frequent fire and sandhill like that, and you're operating at a large scale, which they were at the time, what was happening is the only places that had high quality cover in the landscape were associated with these little ephemeral creeks running through where it was wet. And a lot of the landscape, those little ephemeral creeks, the vegetation that was associated with that was good, high quality fawn structure, was only 20 yards or 30 yards wide often.
Mm-hmm.
And that linear feature of really high quality cover, of course, the fawns are all going to be bedding in that. And whereas the only place on the landscape to key in on where a fawn would be for a coyote is that same cover. And It's now distributed on the landscape in a way that's really easy to hunt.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that's been demonstrated in a few different scenarios where, in agricultural systems where we have really narrow field borders, for instance, we might see higher nest predation in those.
Yeah, that was going to be a question I had, actually, because you were talking about the example you made with the quail, how one of the things that they did was increase, I think you said they were like increasing the habitat around those field borders. Yeah. Like you're saying, I mean, if they're nested in just those little narrow pockets, then it's easy pickings for whatever kind of predator.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the recommendations that's come out of a lot of the quail work in agricultural systems, is that our field borders have some minimum width that they need to be before, we start to have that issue. So, yeah, so that's kind of, one of the things. It's also the habitat complexity is more easily manipulated in many cases, especially for a small landowner. Let's think about, if you've got coyotes that literally might be operating at the county level and you have 100 acres, you're not going to make a difference with trapping.
Right.
It's just, you can't operate at the right scale to do that. And, I think that's what the work is showing, but you can, at that scale, you can increase the habitat quality such that it makes your fawns harder to find.
Right.
While also making more available nutrition for the doe who needs to meet lactation requirements, which are more stringent. And it also happens to be feeding your bucks that are growing antlers at the same time better. You're addressing a lot of things that you want to at the same time with that. The problem comes in when you don't own your own land. You may not have that option.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I can relate to. So some other things that are funny that are going on that I think are really just, they're cool to think about, and probably when we're trying to conceptualize why trapping would be pretty inconsistent, especially when we're thinking about different critters and what their predators are. Mm-hmm. There are a couple of things. One, in the quail world, I think it's been really well demonstrated, but we have a thing called compensatory mortality, and that's just a fancy term for saying that a certain number of individuals in a population are going to die no matter what the cause is.
Okay.
So we often will design hunting programs or bag limits around this idea where, 50% of quail, I'm just making these numbers up, but let's just, for ease of numbers, 50% of quail are going to die. It doesn't matter if 40% of those were killed by us or by other predators. We can kill X percent of that population, and you're never going to have higher than 50% mortality. So, that's one thing that kind of that isn't intuitive immediately to people, but when you start thinking about it, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Like 50% of quail are going to die from some reason or another. So if you remove predators, that doesn't necessarily mean that those 50% still aren't going to die from something else.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And we base our hunting pressure on that in many cases. And I think the quail world is probably the best example. Where we know we have a good idea of how much hunting can be compensatory to other causes, so we can harvest that many and never cause an increase in the background mortality rate. Because the quail that we killed would have been killed by something else anyway, or they would have died from exposure to temperature or rain or something, right?
So that's interesting. So the limits or whatever are getting based on to keep it within that compensatory range.
Yeah, in some cases where we literally are setting bag limits, and often in the quail world that might even be done at the property level, where they've decided, okay, this is what our quail numbers are. We can harvest X% of that. That's how many birds we can take this year. Right? And they're estimating how many.
That's interesting.
Based on that idea.
Yeah, I'd never heard of that before. That's interesting.
So these are kind of the things that are in the scientist weeds that we don't normally talk about. But I found I like to bring them up because I find that people, when they start hearing about that, it's like, oh, that's really cool. It's much more complex than we thought. It's kind of cool. And it also makes sense why we keep saying some of these things without giving you the context. I think that context is important.
Well, and it's like kind of what we've talked about. We've talked about this kind of the last time you were on. I've seen here lately, I don't know if probably the past 2, maybe 3 years, I've just seen this overall growing want for more of that kind of knowledge. And I get it. It bleeds over on this podcast because we put out like I said, we put out all the time. What do y'all want to hear? Because if we're not putting out what they want to hear, then what are we doing?
Exactly.
Exactly. And people are wanting to know. People want to know that kind of stuff, man. Like you said, because had you not told me that, I'm not a scientist. I don't spend the time that you spend out doing that. I wouldn't know that. That's cool information to me. Yeah. And I promise you, some of these listeners will like that.
Well, I hope so. I've kind of seen that over the years. It's with an issue like trapping. It doesn't intuitively right out of the bat. It's not intuitive why scientists would be telling you, well, it's probably not the best way to spend your money if you're not doing these other things, right? And it's not immediately obvious to people who aren't really in the weeds why that might be, because it makes. Intuitively, we would think, oh, you remove predators, you reduce predation, you have more of whatever you're trying to have more of, right? That seems like it should work. And in some cases it does, but it doesn't always. And I'm just I think it's important to tell people some of those reasons it might not work, and then you get a better understanding of it. Yeah. I think we've made the mistake as scientists, and not to speak on the behalf of all scientists, but I think we've made the mistake of assuming that we could just tell people, if you do A, you'll get C, and we'll leave B out.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm hopefully trying to help address that. And I think a lot of scientists are kind of getting to that point. A lot of people know fire is good, or know, you've got a good handle on some of these things that we've been trying to tell you are good or bad for a long time. Now we really need to unpack some of those issues and talk about them in a little more detail.
Yeah, and not only that, it's like take it from like there's a guy, he's a landowner, and this guy, he knows he likes deer hunt, he knows he likes turkey hunt. He's heard from this biologist over here, he needs to do this. He's heard from his buddy that owns land, a couple miles down the road, that he's doing this, and that he thinks this is kind of working. And he listened to this podcast that's telling this, and then he watched this YouTube video. You got all this information. Whereas that's why I bring folks like you and Dr. Chamberlain on here, because we're not discussing opinions here, like we're going off of experiments and times in the field that you've done, and this is why you're coming up with these things, whether someone particularly like, which today we're not really talking about, like last time when we were talking about fire, that, someone could have very sometimes heated opinions on that subject. Today, I don't think we're not really getting into diving into the depths on that with this subject, I don't think. But still, for me, I know if I was a landowner and someone told me, like you said, don't trap, put more emphasis on this, I'd be like, okay, well, why? I want to know those things. These are things that I would want to know. And so I really enjoy the opportunity to give light to that kind of information. For one, I think it needs to be out there. And two, I personally find it interesting. And I think a lot of other people do too.
And I think one of the things, like you were just giving that example, if I just told you don't put your focus on trapping, put it on this other, then that kind of, to me, it would give you the perception that I'm just anti-trapping.
Yeah.
And I'm not.
Yeah.
Like, if you want to go trap, that's fun. I like trapping. It's fun. And I'm just trying to give y'all information on why that might not be the most effective way to meet your objectives, but it is a good tool if you use it in certain ways, to accomplish your objectives. It's just not a sure all, be all, end all solve to your problems.
Right.
So I think that's the problem, is that people get guarded about it, thinking that scientists are just anti-trapping. And I don't think that is the case with a lot of us. It's more of just, we need to be more forthcoming with some of these details that get in the weeds.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, another thing that I think is particularly fascinating, and it is intuitive when you start thinking about it, and I hear people talk about it a little bit, but not necessarily with the name of it. It would be compensatory reproduction.
Okay.
So we just talked about compensatory mortality of the prey. We also have had some data that suggests compensatory reproduction of predators. And essentially what that means is, if you remove predators, the ones that are remaining have more resources available or have some sort of queue where they can expand their litter size.
Huh.
So there's some data, particularly out in the Midwest with coyotes, upper Midwest, and data on some other species of predators suggesting that could be occurring at some level. One thing that you probably have heard of, if you were, you may not have heard that term, but you probably have heard that if you trap pigs, you're going to, the remaining pigs will just have more piglets.
Right.
So that's the same idea, that when you persecute that species by reducing its density like that, we might see an expanded litter size, and coyotes and several other fur bearers like that have that capacity to expand. So one thing that's probably going on to some degree is that we persecute a species and then they just have a higher reproductive rate, and then we end up with more of them, just like we don't actually decrease the population in the long term because they just expand to have more young.
Yeah.
So that's when we think about, if we just keep doing it for years and years and years and years, we're going to end up with less of them, and that's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
Which to me, that when I learned about that, it just kind of blew my mind.
Fascinating, yes. Information that I like hearing, no, I do not. I don't like that one.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that you could never ever decrease the population of a predator because of compensatory reproduction, but it's another interesting thing that sort of muddies up that relationship a little bit.
Yeah, I've heard about that with pigs, and like you said, I've never heard the term compensatory reproduction. I'm going to use that term next time around people, so people think I'm smart. But but no, I've heard of that concept with pigs for sure. But I had no idea that was also something that could be seen in coyotes. What about like other like nest predators like bobcats? Do you see that with those as well?
I don't think there's very strong evidence for bobcats, but some of the other fur bearers, the nesting predators, I think that there's pretty good evidence that can occur. I'm not super familiar with that literature base, but I know that that is a thing that happens.
Yeah.
We'll just put it that way. We have good literature to suggest that happens in lots of species.
Yeah, I don't like that information at all. It's good to know.
Well, that, essentially what that means, and I think pigs are the perfect example of this because a lot of people are trying to get rid of them, right?
Right.
And it's really hard. And what happens is, we have all these different things going on. We're at a big scale. We potentially have litter sizes getting bigger in response to our management. And then another problem that you have in the case of pigs is that the last 10% of them or so are the ones that are really, they're already smart and they're sparse in the environment and they have a high reproductive rate, and they last a little bit in terms of eradicating pigs is the hardest a little bit. It costs us the most money per individual, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but really, I think it's important just to point out that there are actually a lot of biological reasons why we should expect to see some inconsistency in a practice like trapping. Right? You're going to have inconsistent results, and in most, the most intuitive thing that we can take from all of the data when we kind of look at it collectively is that trapping's a really good tool, and you have to be operating at a spatial scale that's relevant to the species you're trying to trap. And that tool is most effective when you have good habitat underlying, the survival of whatever species you want, whether it's deer or turkeys or whatever. If you don't have that underlying good habitat, the trapping is not going to be very effective. Mm-hmm. So really the thing that, because it's at such large scale, I wish that we had some long-term studies to show that, like we do with the quail example. But unfortunately, that's not available right now. We're kind of having piecemeal.
Gotcha.
We know when we trap, even at 10,000 acre scales, we can't consistently increase fawn survival. But we don't have the data showing whether or not that's true when we have manipulated habitat so that it's really high quality as well.
Gotcha.
So we don't know what trapping would do when we put them together, in other words.
So I have, this is like an example, and then you can tell me if it's a good example or not, and then it'll feed into a question. I don't know why I didn't think about this right off the bat. So I know I've got to be pretty vague with the location of this, just to respect the person. I know he wouldn't want me broadcasting specifics of location on this podcast, but it'll still be enough to get. So this is a large ranch out west, and when I say large, I mean it's over 100,000 acres altogether. And it's been within the last 5 years they started trapping it intensively, the whole thing. And from like a firsthand perspective, like I know they had, I think in the first or second year, they saw immediate jumps in fawn success rates in antelope. And then like just from firsthand, I know we were seeing like a lot more small game around there than we used to. Like we were seeing a lot more, like never saw rabbits out there before. All of a sudden we're seeing little rabbits. We're seeing more mule deer than we were. But again, this is on like, it's over 100,000 acres altogether.
Yeah.
But then Bordering Ranch, which also, I think it's similar in size. At the beginning, they were trapping as well. Then they stopped. And this, when I said this could be an example of what you're talking about, when they stopped trapping, they were not seeing as much success on their end as far as fawn success for the antelope and all that. And they were saying because this Bordering Ranch stopped trapping, all they were doing is when they were getting coyotes out of their place, it was just feeding in from the other ranch. Yeah. Does that sound accurate to you?
I think that's reasonable, and I'm basing that on science. The study at Savannah River, they actually, when they were trapping all the coyotes, they started getting genetics on every individual to figure out where are they coming from, and they wanted to know they basically kept trapping and they never ran out of coyotes to trap, even though it was an enormous scale. They just wanted to know where are all the coyotes coming from. Is it actually the individuals that make it through on the property producing more, or are they coming from somewhere else? Or in other words, immigrating in, sort of like what you're describing. And they concluded in that study, which was over a long term, over a giant area, they concluded that most of the coyotes were immigrating in. So that probably is, to some degree, what they were observing is some of the, the larger the scale, especially with coyotes, the larger the scale you go at, the better you would be able to affect, survival rates.
Right.
So I'll also throw another curveball at you, because it's another thing that people don't think about, and it was pretty striking to me. There's one example with coyotes, but the better examples are probably with wolves and some stuff with different puma species. But there's another thing called a mesocarnivore release.
Okay.
And essentially what that means is you have a top predator in the environment, and it sort of suppresses by being there because it eats them or it's competing with them or whatever. It suppresses all these other mesocarnivores. So you have this top carnivore like a wolf, or in one case it was demonstrated with coyotes, where having them on the landscape is suppressing all these other predator species, their populations. And when you remove that predator, like coyotes, there was an example with prairie chickens where they were looking at nest survival. When they removed coyotes, the nest survival decreased.
Wow.
And what they show, it was strong evidence for this mesocarnivore release that I'm talking about. And essentially they removed coyotes, and that allowed the other nest predators that were more problematic for that species to increase in abundance. And they actually ended up with lower nest survival as a result.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. That's one of those deals. So that unknown to them, the coyotes were actually keeping the nest predators in check.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Yeah.
And the coyote will eat a nest, but it's not as efficient as some of those other small carnivores that are really efficient nest predators.
Yeah, actively seeking out nests. Right.
Yeah. So and there's actually some evidence from out in the upper Midwest again where the same kind of thing happened with wolves and coyotes, where wolves are not very keen on killing fawns or calves, depending on what species you're talking about. And removing or decreasing the population of wolves actually resulted in they had evidence that the coyote population was released, which then resulted in less fawns and calves because they were more specialized on or better at killing those. So
wow.
Those kinds of studies, because of the scale and the length of time that you would need to do it and the amount of money that goes into that kind of research, we have data to suggest those are happening, but we often don't really have definitive proof because it's so hard to control different things that are going on. There's a lot of stuff going on at the same time that could be affecting what you see. But what we do know is that in some of those cases, we have strong evidence that removing, with the example of the prairie chicken, removing the coyotes seemed to make the mesocarnivores more abundant, and we definitely had lower survival of nests as a result. So really interesting. And, the reason I bring up all those different things is just to try to make it clear to everybody that it is a really complex issue. It's not as simple as just you remove predator and you get more prey. There's just so much going on in the system, and it's hard for us to to study, much less even understand or apply at the scale that most people can operate.
So that makes me think of, and you'll appreciate this, that makes me think of Dr. Robbie Kroger and my applied aquatic and terrestrial ecology class at Mississippi State.
Yeah.
And I remember, because I say this a lot to this day, he taught us, it was like the day 1 or day 2 of that class. He was talking about ecological maxims. And I think there's 5 of them. But the one that I remember is that he said, you can never just do one thing.
Yeah.
You can never ever just do one thing. And when at first I didn't know what any of them meant at first. You had to explain them, obviously. But the more I think about that one, like this topic exactly, it's like you can't, it's too complex. You can't just go, I'll take the coyotes and then I get more prairie chickens. You can't just do that. It's not how it works. It'd be nice sometimes if it did, but there's way too many complexities and little things, little pieces and parts making all this work, that it's not that black and white.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. The thing that I tell students, because I teach all the time, and I commonly get this from students, like, man, why has that got to be so hard and complex? Like, I don't understand. I'm constantly throwing things like this at them that's confusing them, because they start thinking about one thing one way, and it's like, well, we have all these caveats and context dependencies and all this. And then I tell them, you should be happy that it's this hard. We wouldn't need wildlife biologists and ecologists if it wasn't hard. If we understood all this fully, why would we need us? So it's job security on our end. There's frustration on the landowner end.
Yeah. Well, there's this, when I say there's a famous Aldo Leupold quote, there's like a billion famous Aldo Leupold quotes, but there's one I remember he said one, and I'm not going to try to say it verbatim because I couldn't do it. But that's basically what he's saying is like, out of all the little complexities in nature, he says like something about all the little salient facts or something like that. He says it is absolutely impossible to learn all the facts about a single one of them, because there's just so many things going on at once. And like to your point, it's job security for a wildlife biologist, because there's always something. There's all little things that all interconnects. It's a lot, but that's what makes it interesting.
One of my favorite quotes, I don't remember the scientist who said it now, but someone once said, and I'm going to paraphrase again, not only is it more complex than we think, it's more complex than we can think.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to look at it as well. But yeah, unfortunately, I think it comes across with this particular issue that all the biologists are just anti-trapping, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. It certainly isn't with me. So I don't want people to think that, but there are a lot of complexities. And the reason that I think a lot of us go to habitat is, one thing we pretty well demonstrated is, if you improve habitat, you get more of what the species you want. That's a pretty safe bet in most cases.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Well, that's going to be the title of this episode, because we're going to go the clickbait route. The title's going to be the title's going to be Dr. Marcus Lashley hates trapping. That's what.
That's
it'll get some listens.
It'll get some listens, but you'll probably get my inbox full before.
No, I wouldn't do that.
Every once in a while, I'll get some phone calls or online. People will be commenting on stuff. It's like, did you actually watch what was in the thing that, like the question or the hate you're pushing my way? That's not what this was about. Yeah, no,
I wouldn't do a clickbait title. That would be, I want you to come on more in the future. So that would probably be a little bridge burner there if I was to go and do something like that.
Well, I'd take enough heat for saying something like, well, you probably shouldn't focus on trapping first. It's a good tool. Like, I catch enough heat for just saying something like that without giving you a lot of context. So
sure.
Please don't.
That was, well, like the other thing is that, and one of the reasons why we talked about that today, and I've talked about this on here before, when it comes to habitat management, property management, whatever you want to call it, a common theme that I see, and I'm sure you do too. It's like people are looking for a silver bullet. They're looking for that. What's the thing that I can do to ill all my problems? And like to our point, like we're talking about the different complexities, you're not going to find that. It's just trapping seems to be the easy thing to gravitate towards. But like you said, right. no one here is anti-trapping.
Right.
I'm not. You're not. You're just
on the, just to use a similar thing, they want the silver bullet that they can, plant or that's the thing we want to, we're farmers by nature, right?
Yeah.
And there are a lot of great things that you can plant, but normally you're only addressing one or two things, right? That's not the only thing you can do. It's just one of your tools. And if we don't do anything but plant something and trap something, then you're missing part of the puzzle. And that's kind of what I'm trying to come along with it. Those are great tools to have in the arsenal and use them, but understand that all of it is hinging on having that underlying habitat in good shape to start with.
Right. Understood. Well, man, I've kept you for the better part of an hour, and I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. And like I said, we're not going to go with that clickbait title because I want you to come back on in the future.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Man, I tell you, like, I don't know like a time frame on it yet, but I know when we spoke in the past, and one thing that you offered up as far as subject we can talk about, I know sometime before next fall, when we get to where we're talking about deer hunting all the time, I really would like to talk kind of more in depth about quail. Something about I've talked to Adam Butler again about this a little bit, like the part of their ecology intrigues me. One of the things that intrigues me particularly is like kind of the story of their demise in my state, particularly because it hurts me that happened because of how much I've fallen in love with quail hunting, and I wish I could do it here more. So, but yeah, that's one thing I would like to have you on at some point about.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. And I put a lot of stuff on social media about quail because I'm lucky enough that I work in a place that has a whole bunch of them. Not many places like that anymore.
Yeah.
So I'd love to talk about quail. And they are the true firebird. So I like talking about them a lot. I talk about them a lot because of that.
Yeah. Well, we'll line that up for sure. But as for today, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for dealing with me. I know we were supposed to, the original plan for doing this podcast was like, I don't know, earlier this week, but
yeah, no problem. Hey, you were getting to have some fun, so that's what it sounded like anyway.
Yeah, trying to chasing that spring turkey as long as we possibly can. So
there you go.
But yeah, we'll wrap this conversation up, guys. I hope y'all enjoyed it. Again, check out the University of Florida Deer Lab, their Instagram. Honestly, it's been such a fun source to watch and learn from. Like, again, this was the whole point of, or how this whole podcast today came from, is from something that they posted. So check them out. And thank you for coming on. We'll wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thank you all for listening to the Speak the Language podcast.